Welcome to Revolutions Weekly, where we dive into the details of many periodic revolutions, elections. I'm your host Alvin, and this week we're going to be doing something a little bit different once again. In fact, we're actually going to be talking about our first South American election by looking at the Peruvian elections that are actually going to be happening this Saturday. So, I think it's like if you don't know much about Latin American politics, or about about Peruvian politics in particular, that's fine. It's like that's what I'm here for, basically. And because I didn't really know much about it either initially, but after doing some research, after learning about the things that are kind of like happening in the current election and the things that have happened in the past, it's certainly an interesting like dynamic that we can look at, and kind of speaks to like the larger dynamics found within Latin American politics more generally. So, with that being said, let's just get straight into it. So, when you think of Peru, like you kind of think of like, just any average South American country, like Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, like it's no Brazil, it's no Venezuela, but I think like it certainly is a significant country in the Americas, a significant country in the world. I think it's like Peru makes, for example, it's like world's second largest producer of copper, for example. And just like things like that that you might not know. But I think like Peruvian politics as well is actually really interesting. So Peru in itself actually is a relatively new democracy. And when it comes to Latin America, actually, just because of the Cold War, democracy has just been general been like a very new recent phenomenon. So in Peru, it's only since the 1980 specifically, that there has been actual consistent elections and consistent changes in government. So before this, of course, like most of Latin America, it was a right-wing military junta. And so, elections and free speech and all these kinds of things were like heavily suppressed. So now that we got that out of the way, so who are the kind of like the main contenders in this upcoming election? So this election in particular is actually really interesting, and the reason I've actually even heard about it, and the reason I've actually decided to cover it ultimately, is actually because of of the two interesting candidates that are actually running in this particular election. So on the one side, you have a guy by the name of Pedro Castillo. So he's actually a poor teacher and like union leader from the Department of Cajamarca. So essentially, he's like from like the interior provinces. He's nowhere near Lima, Cusco, like the richer regions of Peru, and he kind of grew up in like this department, which which Cajamarca actually has like Peru's largest gold mine, for example. But you know, but it's actually like one of Peru's like poorest departments. So it's like the fact that like you live in a province with like large deposits of natural resources, you live in a country with large deposits of natural resources, and yet you still have widespread poverty, kind of speaks to to both the inequalities found within Peru, and as well, and kind of like kind of tells you a little bit about what his politics is going to be, which we'll get to in a little bit. And the other candidate for this race is Keiko Fujimori. Now, if you're wondering what's a Japanese name doing in a Peruvian election, interestingly enough, I think 25% of Peru is actually of East Asian descent, so both Chinese and Japanese descent. And the Fujimori name in particular is actually really significant in Peru because, like, Keiko Fujimori's father, Alberto Fujimori, is actually, Peru's longest running president since the establishment of democracy in 1980. And he, is a very controversial figure in his own right.
With lots of corruption scandals, lots of dubious political practices in his belt, but also, most notably, literally nearly crippling Peruvian democracy in 1993 by rewriting the constitution to give the president more power and by dissolving parliament at the same time. So, going back to the candidates, first of all, we have
Pedro Castillo is running with the Free Peru Party, which, actually is a pretty insignificant party. Like it didn't have really seats in the National Congress, for example. But but it's a far left party. It's like economically, like very like nationalist, very like collectivist, things like that. And then on the next side we have the Popular Force, like headed by Keiko Fujimori herself, which is a quote unquote Fujimorist party, which is a lot more right wing, a lot more neoliberal, a lot more establishment. So so on the one hand we have like a very socialist, we have like a very like collectivist, a very populist party, and on the other side we have like a very standard neoliberal, or very standard, like not really centrist, even like even a little bit more towards the right wing side of politics, and Fujimori's as well. And and just like quickly, so I think it's like Alberto Fujimori is actually responsible for many of like the neoliberal reforms in the 90s in Peru itself. And and he was actually part of like the many leaders at the time who actually instituted a lot of these neoliberal reforms, a lot of which actually ended up disenfranchising a lot of people. Now, just like a quick note as well. So, for Fujimori, this is going to be her third one for president. And for Pedro Castillo, it's going to be his first run as president. So, what's interesting, with the Peruvian system, and I think it's like a lot of systems in the world operate in the same way, is that there was actually two rounds of voting. So in the first round of voting, there was about 10 candidates, I believe. So it's like a whole bunch of different parties, both, like really significant parties in the Congress, as well as parties like, like Free Peru, which don't even have seats in the Congress, but, but are allowed to field candidates nevertheless. So basically what kind of happened is that, like Pedro Castillo in this first round managed to get 18%, which is actually a very small number, if you think about it. And Keiko Fujimori is actually able to get 13%, even smaller. So interestingly enough, 13% is actually smaller than the number of, like uncountable ineligible ballots. So, it kind of speaks to like the sort of like trends that you're kind of seeing within Peruvian politics. And every other candidate, got like abysmal numbers as well, 11%, 8%. So basically, there was a lot of candidates, and a lot of them got like only about like 8, 9, 10%. So that's kind of like the picture that you kind of see, where it's like, yeah, basically there's not really like, there wasn't, at least, like in the first round, a clear contender. I guess the clearest contender, of course, would be Pedro Castillo, and that's why, like he's kind of like, going to the second round, and why he's kind of like getting steam and getting prominence as well. And, just in general, so essentially, we have in general this like left right wing fight, so we have like the left wing, represented by Free Peru and Pedro Castillo, and we have the right wing represented by Keiko Fujimori and the Popular Force. So of course, with like the left wing politics side of things, like left wing, like kind of like politics in Latin America has always been like a very, like contentious subject, but also like a very interesting subject as well, in that, like people tend to have really mixed feelings about left wing politics, about, like socialist politicians, communist politicians, just, like just in general, like Latin America has this really amicable relationship with socialism in some cases, in the case of Venezuela, Bolivia, like Ecuador, Cuba, and then, and in some cases, like a really antagonistic relationship because of all the right-wing juntas over the decades, like in Chile, like in Brazil, in Peru. So that's kind of like what the left wing side of things look like. But in the right wing side of things, like in Peru specifically, it's the right wing, like sort of like faction of Peruvian politics, is very much attached to the legacy of Alberto Fujimori. Like I said earlier, he's kind of like the guy in the 90s who not only instituted a lot of these neoliberal reforms, a lot of these like, like right wing policies as well, but, like going up, when he was first running as president, his coalition was literally small and medium business owners, as well as evangelical Protestants, which is, interesting since, Peru's majority Catholic. But, like what I've been saying a couple of times in the show is that, like you don't really need a lot of people to be with you initially, but you really only need a certain percentage of people to passionately support you. And in Alberto Fujimori's case, it was the evangelical Christians. So he went up, like that way. So as such, his economics would have been and was, like a lot more neoliberal, a lot more pro-business, for example, anti-union, so you would get the idea because, of course, the business owners put him in power. But at the same time, he's also very right-wing, anti-abortion, on like all the social issues, very, very right-wing as well because of evangelical Christians. And just like, in general, like the country is a conservative Catholic country. So, you could see why that's the case. And of course, like besides this tenuous relationship with left-wing factions in Latin America, I think like besides that dynamic of, that we see with Pedro Castillo, we also see this dynamic of anti-Fujimorism, in that Pedro Castillo in this instance is the most viable resistance against the Fujimori legacy, basically, the Fujimori order. And of course, like Keiko, like of course wanting to uphold the legacy of her own father would of would of course, like support a lot of Fujimorist policies. But that doesn't mean she's only supportive of those policies. Of course, she has her own kind of ideas of what Peru should be. But most of it is certainly within the line of Fujimorism, whereas Pedro Castillo's campaign is run by this idea of anti-Fujimorism as a resistance against the neoliberal order, a resistance against the establishment. And like then you might be thinking, it's like, like in a time like this, like how is it that this
Anti-establishment.
radical candidate was actually able to rise up? Because in previous elections, although there were certainly left-wing candidates, viable candidates, like who actually managed to beat Keiko Fujimori in the two other elections, for example, why this time, we have this radical, like school teacher from a rural region, like who, interestingly enough, actually gained prominence because in 2017, I believe there was a teacher strike in Peru, and that's how he managed to gain national name recognition, basically. So he was a teacher and he was a union leader. So that's kind of like how he got going. So why is this person who's like nowhere near being a politician, who's nowhere near like the capitals, like capital of Lima or like all the other richer regions, who's very very like anti-establishment, like why is he able to go up? So interestingly enough, actually, like of course, like in general, we live in interesting times in that around the world we have a lot of these interesting people going into politics. But in Peru specifically, it's actually interesting that this whole previous year, actually, like there's been a huge wave, a series of like things happening, a series of trends, which kind of like show that that there is this like like bubbling anger against the establishment, like the Fujimori regime in particular, of course, because that's what started it all. So, for example, there was a Peruvian protest, a really big one actually last year, because that's due to the fact that I think so. Essentially, what had happened was that there was a whole bunch of impeachments going on last year, and literally Peru went through three different presidents in 2020. So up to right now, they've basically had four presidents within the last year. So there was one guy who got elected, he actually resigned. Then his vice president took over. But when he wanted to crack down on corruption, the Congress literally impeached him over dubious claims. And so they installed another guy who established a far right-wing government. And this is when the protests actually happened. And after this protest happened, he got impeached. And then we have the current guy. Now the current guy is like a like a moderate mellow centrist, so like not much is happening in that way, and he probably rightly knows that if he was to do anything radical right now, it wouldn't really fare well for him, but also for the stability of the country. But that's basically like what kind of happened last year, and just with COVID and just things like that in general, you would kind of like see like with like people being like really like kind of like mad about like their horrible handling. Actually, interestingly enough, Peru actually has like the world's like highest per capita death rate of for COVID. So like that's the case, and unemployment went up by like 10% last year as well. So it's definitely not a really good situation in Peru right now, and that's basically why people have been like so willing to vote for so-called radical candidates. And I guess in this case, like Pedro Castillo is their man. So then, of course, we see like this huge like battle essentially. So, but then like you see this argument, but then there's also like a couple of counters as well. For example, like there's actually a huge right wing and centrist prominence in the Congress, for example, and it's not just Fujimori's parties. So, of course, like interesting enough, I think like last year they actually had a parliamentary election which elected a lot of these new parties. Bear in mind though that Keiko Fujimori's popular force specifically went down drastically. It was actually like I believe about a third of like the Congress, and like now they only have like 13 seats or like something like that. It's really abysmal. But but like I said, like for all the other parties in parliament, there are a whole bunch of other right wing, a whole bunch of centrist parties as well. Now, of course, centrists, tend to kind of like, like although, like they might have their own different platforms, ultimately, centrism stands for the status quo. Centrism stands for this current neoliberal order. So that's why, centrism can also be lumped into establishment as well, in to varying degrees and extents. So, for example, you have Popular Action with 24 seats, Alliance for Progress 20, and Popular Force, which only has 14. Popular Force being Keiko Fujimori's own party. So, so you see the top three parties in the parliament are actually all, right wing and centrist parties. So then, you could say, oh, well, if they had an election last year, then why is it that all these centrist and right wing parties are still able to maintain a significant lead against the other left wing parties, and a lot of these more radical parties didn't get voted in? So that's a fair argument. But then, of course, you'll have to consider as well the fact that these parliamentary elections actually happened in January 2020. So literally long before this whole debacle with the impeachments, this whole thing with the corruption scandals with the right-wing governments, with the protests. So basically, before all this happened, they had the parliamentary election, and that's kind of like what is reflected in these results. But it kind of shows you as well that, although right-wing politics in Peru, centrist politics in Peru is still very much alive, Fujimori's politics might be on the way out. And that's, certainly interesting to see what will happen to, Keiko's Fujimori's prospects in this upcoming election. And of course, like what the same thing you might see in like the US, for example, with Joe Biden, you kind of see that, a lot of people don't actually really like Keiko Fujimori or don't really like Fujimorism specifically. But because she's the only right-wing candidate running against literally a radical left-wing candidate, that's basically the only option. So Fujimorism might be on its last legs, might be on the way out. But because she's the only viable candidate right now, it will probably give her life, the movement life, the Fujimorism, like ideology, a few more years of viability. But anyways, another interesting thing I like to point out as well is, I keep telling you, like we have, like the Free Peru Party, a very left-wing party. We have the Popular Force, a right-wing party. But, so far, that's what I've been telling you, but that's really only true economically. Now, see, socially, both are actually relatively conservative. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying, like with how Alberto Fujimori was able to win his election in the 90s, basically was, he was basically essentially able to, bring up this like right-wing revolutionary fervor, right-wing populist fervor within the electorate. But just in general, he was able to do that because the country is still relatively conservative. And that's kind of like why, Free Peru, for example, is, although economically socialist, economically populist, socially they are still very conservative. So, for example, like in terms of things like, LGBTQ rights, in terms of abortion policy, in terms of just like the rhetoric around nationalism and things like that, it's still very right wing. It's still very conservative. So, that's basically what we have, in both Free Peru, but also in some left wing parties as well. There's a couple of progressive, like left wing, socially left wing parties, but, they're way less viable than Free Peru is right now, which kind of speaks to, the need to, it kind of speaks to both the need to both adapt left-wing policies to the, the actual social conditions, and just like the fact that, like in the West, they have this idea that, that left-wing politics economically necessarily means left-wing politics socially. But, you see in Latin America, and you see in most of Asia and some parts of Africa, that's not really necessarily the case. Granted, there are some countries in Latin America itself, like Argentina, for example, or Chile, which has this progressive platform, even with a right-wing traditionalist platform. But, in the case of Peru, what we see is the opposite, where it's like, yeah, it's like not necessarily just because you want nationalization, just because you want, you want to rally against the establishment, that doesn't necessarily mean you might be the most liberal when it comes to social policies. So that's interesting as well. And the next thing as well, in terms of trends, a lot of like what Keiko Fujimori's campaign has been saying about Pedro Castillo is that, it's the same argument basically that Trump used against Joe Biden stupidly, but it's the same argument where, oh, if you vote for this guy, he's going to turn your country to Venezuela. He's going to turn your country to Cuba. Now, do you want to live in Venezuela or Cuba? Like you want to, I like this guy, like this farmer with no political experience, with no political acumen, or you want to elect somebody like Fujimori, who is experienced, who's been in Congress, whose father was, I guess in this case, quote unquote, a great president. Of course, Alberto Fujimori himself is really touchy, but that's why sometimes, Keiko Fujimori plays a strategy where she might go against her own father if it's convenient. But anyways, basically their main line of attack is basically, oh, you want to be Venezuela, you want to be, Cuba, and of course, basically what the Pedro Castillo campaign has been going against Fujimori for is the standard anti-establishment, the populist rhetoric about, I think it's like his motto, for example, is like no more poor people in a rich country. So you get the idea of like what his whole platform is about. It's about rallying against the establishment, whereas Fujimori's thing is about, oh, let's prevent this greater evil from happening to our beloved country. And so that's basically what kind of is. But but based on the rhetoric, what I'm starting to get is the idea that it's gonna be less like a Venezuela. It's gonna be way less like a Cuba. And I think most likely what's gonna happen to Peru if Pedro Castillo actually wins is that he's probably gonna follow like a Bolivia model. Now, granted, the Bolivia model isn't exactly the best for business people, sure, but it is certainly the best when it comes to actually lifting quality of life. Now, with like in Bolivia, like as soon as Evo Morales was able to get into power, like literally literacy rate shot up, GDP per capita shot up, prosperity shot up. So, it is a viable model and it is a successful model. So that's basically what Pedro Castillo is likely to do when he actually does get into power. But don't get me wrong, this movement that that Free Peru is like heading is certainly like similar, and it certainly has has solidarity with a lot of the other Latin American socialist movement, like the socialism of the 21st century movements, found in Bolivia with Evo Morales, found in Venezuela with Hugo Chavez, found in Nicaragua, I forgot the guy's name, Cuba, of course, like being the OG, and of course, Ecuador as well more recently. So that's basically what's likely to happen, in that, like all this campaign about, him wanting to destroy the country is very typical of, of like right-wing rhetoric in the Americas, but also in other parts of the world as well to an extent. So whereas, like the left-wing rhetoric in this case is also similar to what you find in other countries, this idea of anti-establishment politics, this idea of, populist politics, just in general, things like that. And like I said, in general, we live in weird times, so politics is bound to be very polarized and very radical. Bearing all this in mind, what do the polls actually say about these two? So, like I said, like in the first round of voting, Castillo managed to gain 18 points and Fujimori gained 13. So, it's a pretty significant lead when looked at that way. But, remember, we still have the other 69. What do they say and what are their political leanings? So right now, as the polls stand, we kind of have a slight lead for Castillo, actually. It's a very small lead, so that's why it's a very razor-sharp race. Initially, Castillo had a huge lead against Fujimori, because of course, Fujimori has a lot more baggage. Let's just make that clear. But as people try to promote her as the lesser evil, as the more competent of the two, the gap kind of begins to close, and now we kind of have this neck-to-neck race basically between the two. So right now, it's still a slight lead for Castillo, but it's within 3%, meaning we're within the margin of error. And, even though the polls kind of show a tight race, don't get me wrong, the polls in this case actually were completely wrong in the first round. They predicted somebody else completely to actually win the first place. And like what ended up happening was that, like not only did they get it wrong, they didn't even consider Pedro Castillo at all. And Pedro Castillo ended up, like soaring high in that first round. So it might not even really help us in the second round to determine who might actually win. So, it might be, like a Castillo landslide even. It might be a Fujimori, victory, slightly. Because don't get me wrong, Fujimori in her last 3 elections actually always managed to get into the top 2. And every time she's in the top 2, she always lost by like 1 or 2%. So, maybe there is this like silent majority of Fujimori's voters just waiting to, like vote their person into office. But, with just how low, like just like the decline in general of the Fujimori brand, you might not see as high of a turnout, as high of a numbers for her, even despite the fact that she is promoted as the lesser evil between Kerr and Castillo. So we'll just have to see. But if Fujimori does get elected, you would get, I think, what like some people are saying is like the first woman of Japanese descent to be elected as leader anywhere in the world, because Japan doesn't have a female prime minister yet. But if you have Castillo, then of course you probably see an Evo Morales kind of like movement in Peru itself, and you might see a similar development trajectory. We'll just have to see, but it'll be interesting to see what the results are nevertheless. So anyways, that's all I have for you for now. Like stay tuned for the actual results, like when they actually come out. So in terms of what I might do, in the upcoming few weeks, there's going to be a lot of good elections coming up, certainly. And, and if there aren't, I'll definitely discuss a lot of like other thematic things. But, that's all I have for you for now. And, if you're on Spotify, if you're on other podcast platforms, give this podcast a follow. If you're on YouTube, do the usual, comment, rate, and subscribe. And, just like put in the comments, like what you kind of think the results will be, or like when the results do come out, like how close was I, or like what do you think this might do for like Peruvian politics and just for Peruvian development in general. So anyways, that's all I have for you now. See you next time.